My own brother suddenly shoved me into the pitch-black cargo hold of a scrap ship, then tightly locked the steel door from the outside. The padlock let out a dry, harsh clack, trapping me completely amidst the freezing graveyard of abandoned ships. "You should have signed that paper in the first place, Morgan," he said coldly through the thick steel. It was then that I realized my brother had just left me to die in order to steal everything that belonged to me. He thought that by imprisoning me inside this flooded, rusting mass of steel, he could strip away my entire executive control over the shipyard that our father had left for me to protect. But what he had forgotten, or deliberately chosen not to remember, was that deep inside the cabin of the abandoned, dilapidated tugboat, right next to this hold, a communication system he thought had died long ago was still waiting for a lifeline frequency to be activated. Before I tell you about the voice that answered me through the static of that old VHF radio, and how I made his entire multi-million-dollar underground deal go up in smoke, tell me where you're hearing this story from. Right now, what is the time and weather like where you are? I am always curious to know just how far the boundaries of family greed and betrayal can reach. And if you have ever been the one staying up all night out in a grease-stained shipyard just to protect your father's legacy while others sit in air-conditioned rooms, figuring out how to sell it out, you will understand exactly why I refused to let myself collapse in the darkness that day. 5 weeks before that ballast tank door slammed shut, my father passed away on a night of a blizzard so severe that the ocean's surface froze into a thin, dreary gray layer of ice. He was Arthur Vale, the man who single-handedly built the Vale Marine Shipyard from nothing but his bare hands, a wasteland by the port, and an ironclad belief that a good ship is one that protects its sailors' lives when the ocean rages. We didn't build luxurious yachts for the elite. We built icebreakers, rescue vessels, tugboats, and heavy-duty transport ballast tanks for the fleets facing the most treacherous waters of the Great Lakes. I grew up amidst the roaring of power hammers, the smell of heated steel, and the bitter, salty taste of the sea breeze. Since I was 16, I had been crawling into the bilges to inspect welds. By 26, I was managing all the engineering blueprints, maintenance schedules, maritime administration safety certifications, and operational risks that no auditor's balance sheet could ever capture. My father always said, "A pretty drawing on paper can fool a bank, but a sloppy weld will sink the whole ship to the bottom of the sea. Trust in the steel, Morgan." My brother, Logan Vale, chose an entirely different path. He preferred expensive Italian suits, calls with venture capital funds, and polished leather shoes that never caught a single drop of engine oil. He used to work at a major bank in New York before returning, and my father once hoped his financial expertise would help modernize the shipyard. He had a real way with words, always knowing how to explain away a quarter's losses using flowery macroeconomic jargon to pacify the creditors. But behind that perfect smile was always a cold calculation, as if every word spoken had a price tag that only he could see. After my father died, the will was read in a small, stifling conference room above the factory floor. The lawyer announced that I received 55% controlling interest and supreme shares of Vale Marine, while Logan received only 45% of the profit value and had absolutely no authority over operations, selling the fleet, or transferring the land. Logan didn't say a word. He merely let out a very soft scoff under his breath. It was the laugh of a man who believed he deserved to be king but had just been stripped of his crown by a piece of paper. He looked at me as if I were the thief. He began his covert sabotage campaign the very next week. First, there were the midnight calls, feigning concern that I was overwhelmed with grief, suggesting I sign a temporary power of attorney so he could shoulder the relationships with the creditors. When I refused, he secretly used my account in the internal system to email a shady shipping syndicate, hinting that Vale Marine was on the brink of bankruptcy and ready to sell off the port land for cheap. But the most vicious incident was when an old inspector named Elias knocked on my door with a crumpled canvas hat in his hands. He said the technical safety report for a newly launched tugboat had been altered. My original version confirmed the steel structure met the standards, but the version uploaded to the maritime administration system showed a critical crack in the ship's hull, a flaw that could have the shipyard's license revoked immediately. The one who digitally signed off on that flawed version was my electronic account. He was building a fake dossier to prove that I was a negligent engineer, psychologically unstable after our father's death, and a danger to the company. That night, he asked me to meet him at the old North Pier shipbreaking yard, which our father had abandoned 3 years ago, claiming he had found Dad's original hard copy files that could clear my name before the federal inspection team arrived on Monday morning. I believed him, because a part of me still remembered the older brother who had pulled me out of a frozen lake when I was 9 years old. I drove to the desolate pier just as the sun was setting. He stood there wearing a luxurious wool coat amidst the piles of rusting scrap metal and handed me a thick folder filled with forged psychiatric reports and a 90-day voting rights transfer agreement. "Sign it, Morgan, and all these legal troubles will disappear," he said, his smile as gentle as a savior's. When I looked into his eyes and realized the whole truth, I pulled out my phone to call my lawyer, but he was faster. He violently twisted my wrist, snatched the phone, threw my car keys into the snow, and tricked me into stepping inside the ballast tank of the scrap ship with the lie that the original documents were in there. One shove and darkness crashed down. His footsteps faded away. The engine of his SUV roared to life and then vanished down the coastal road, leaving me entirely alone in the steel vault where seawater was beginning to seep through the rusted crevices and the cold started creeping up from my feet. The first hour inside the ballast tank was an exercise in cold, unforgiving mathematics. I did not waste my energy screaming. A commercial ship's bulkhead is engineered from reinforced steel, designed to withstand the crushing, unyielding pressure of the freezing ocean. A human fist pounding against it is nothing but a ghost knocking on a vault. When the heavy, mechanical lock snapped into place on the outside, plunging me into absolute, suffocating darkness, I stood perfectly still. I closed my eyes and listened. The dry dock was supposedly abandoned, but a shipyard is never truly silent. I could hear the wind howling off the lake, tearing through the rusted cranes above. But more terrifying than the wind was the slow, rhythmic drip, 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 echoing near my boots. The hull of this decommissioned vessel was fractured. Freezing lake water was seeping through a failed valve at the bottom of the tank, pooling over the rusted floor plates. I dragged my bare hands along the freezing, jagged steel walls, mapping the dimensions of my cage in the pitch black. The temperature inside the metal hull was dropping rapidly as the sun set outside. In Duluth, a night inside an unheated steel box was just as lethal as drowning. I zipped my work jacket up to my chin and began walking tight, continuous circles to keep the blood moving in my legs. With every step, my brother's meticulously crafted plan became clearer, sickeningly brilliant in its cruelty. Logan didn't just want the shipyard. If it had been purely about the money, he could have tied me up in endless probate court, suffocated me with legal fees, and forced a buyout. But he wanted something far more insidious. He wanted the legacy without the guilt. He needed the board of directors, the maritime unions, and our father's oldest friends to believe that I was broken. He wanted them to look at my disappearance as a tragic mental collapse, a daughter buckling under the immense pressure of a man's industry. By the time someone eventually found me locked in a scrap vessel, he would be holding the signed bills of sale, shaking his head in mock sorrow at my supposed breakdown. The freezing water crested the rubber soles of my boots. My toes began to numb, sending sharp, vibrating aches up my calves. I forced myself to walk faster. My father used to bring me down into these very hulls when I was a teenager. "The sea doesn't care about your excuses, Morgan," he would say, his voice echoing off the curved metal. "It only respects the steel you put between you and the deep." Now, that very steel was my executioner. About 3 hours into the darkness, my boot caught on something heavy and plastic near the back corner of the tank. I stumbled, splashing into the frigid water. My hands scrambled blindly over the rusted floor until I felt the shape of an old, discarded Pelican case. It must have been left behind by the salvage crew weeks ago. My freezing, stiff fingers fumbled with the heavy latches. Inside, the foam was damp and smelled of mildew. I felt a flare gun, empty. I felt a coil of frayed nylon rope, useless. And then, my hand brushed against thick, rubberized plastic and a short, stubby antenna. A handheld VHF marine radio. I pulled it to my chest like it was a beating heart. My hands shook violently as I felt for the power knob. I twisted it. Nothing happened. The battery was dead. I let out a ragged breath, the sound echoing miserably in the dark. But my thumb brushed the back of the radio, feeling a rough, textured panel. It was a solar charging backplate. It had been sitting in this dark box for weeks, but before that, it might have caught enough deck sunlight to hold a residual charge. I rubbed the battery casing vigorously against my jacket, trying to transfer any fraction of body heat to the cold lithium cells, praying for a chemical reaction. After 5 agonizing minutes, I twisted the knob again. A tiny, faint green LED flickered to life. A low hiss of static crackled through the speaker. It was alive, but it was starving. The low battery indicator was flashing a desperate red warning. I didn't have time to scan frequencies. I didn't have time to hope a random Coast Guard cutter was close enough to catch a handheld signal through inches of solid steel. I switched the dial to channel 74, the old private frequency my father used to use for the overnight maintenance crews. "Mayday," I whispered, pressing the push-to-talk button, terrified the radio would die mid-sentence. "This is Morgan Vale. I am trapped inside the hull of the decommissioned ironclad at the North Pier dry dock. I have no heat. The tank is taking on water. Please." I released the button. Static hissed. "Is anyone listening?" My voice cracked, the cold finally reaching my chest. "Logan locked me in. He's selling the fleet. Please." The green light flickered, threatening to go out forever. I closed my eyes, resting my forehead against the freezing metal wall. Then, the static broke. "That is a hell of a ghost to hear on this frequency." A gruff, bitter voice crackled through the speaker. I snapped my head up. "Who is this?" A long, heavy pause hung in the airwaves. "The man your brother threw overboard 2 years ago to save his own skin." My breath caught. Elias Vance. He had been Vale Marine's chief structural inspector for 2 decades. 2 years ago, a catastrophic hull failure on a contracted cargo ship nearly sank the company. The forged inspection logs, the manipulated safety data, the missing digital signatures, they had all pointed perfectly to Elias. Logan had fired him, publicly disgraced him, and ruined his pension to satisfy the investigators. I had believed the paperwork. I had believed my brother. "Elias," I said, my voice shaking uncontrollably now. "I am so sorry." "Sorry doesn't keep the cold out, Morgan," Elias replied, his voice hard, devoid of sympathy. "Why should I drive out to a frozen scrapyard to help a Vale? Your brother made sure I couldn't even get a job fueling dinghies at the marina." The red battery light began to blink rapidly. I had seconds left. "Because he's doing to me exactly what he did to you." I rushed out, my teeth chattering as the freezing water rose to my ankles. "He altered the safety logs. He forged the psychiatric reports. But Elias? I found his terminal access records. I have the proof of what he did to you." The radio went dead silent. The hissing static was gone. "Elias?" I begged. "Elias, please!" The green light on the radio flashed one final, pathetic time, and then the unit died completely. The darkness rushed back in, heavier and colder than before. I dropped the useless plastic box into the freezing water. I didn't know if my last sentence had transmitted. I didn't know if Elias had hung up in disgust, or if he was already putting on his boots. I wrapped my arms tightly around my chest, leaned against the steel bulkhead, and prepared to find out if the man my family ruined was a better person than the brother I had trusted. Time loses its shape when you're standing in freezing water in total darkness. I didn't know if I had been leaning against the rusted bulkhead for 30 minutes or 3 hours after the radio died. The lake water had steadily crept past my heavy work boots, soaking through my denim jeans, rising relentlessly until it reached my mid-thighs. The biting, agonizing pain of the cold had eventually given way to a terrifying numbness. I knew enough about hypothermia from maritime survival courses to understand exactly what that meant. My body was giving up. It was retreating, pulling blood away from my extremities to protect my heart, preparing me to quietly fall asleep in the freezing dark. I forced myself to bite down on the inside of my cheek just to feel a spark of sharp pain. I kept my eyes open, staring into the absolute black, refusing to let Logan's narrative become my reality. Then I heard it. It wasn't a voice. It was a vicious, mechanical screech echoing against the heavy steel door. A split second later, a brilliant shower of orange sparks hissed through a rusted gap near the deadbolt. Someone was on the other side with an industrial angle grinder. The shrieking of metal tearing through metal was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The heavy lock groaned, glowed red hot, and finally gave way with a violent snap. The heavy door was kicked open, groaning on its rusted hinges. Harsh, blinding light from a heavy-duty tactical flashlight cut through the damp darkness of the tank, hitting my face. I squinted, raising a numb, trembling hand to shield my eyes. Standing in the doorway was a silhouette of a broad-shouldered man in a worn canvas coat. He lowered the flashlight, revealing the weathered, deeply lined face of Elias Vance. He looked older than I remembered from 2 years ago, his beard entirely gray, but his eyes were sharp and furious. He didn't offer a generic apology or ask if I was okay. He could see I wasn't. Elias waded 3 steps into the freezing water, grabbed me by the straps of my life vest, and hauled me out of the iron tomb. The freezing evening air outside felt like a warm embrace compared to the suffocating chill of the tank. I collapsed onto the gravel, my teeth chattering so violently I couldn't form a sentence. Elias threw a heavy, fleece-lined thermos blanket over my shoulders and handed me a thermos of scalding black coffee. "The police and an ambulance are waiting at the main gate," Elias said gruffly, packing up his grinder. "Let's get you to the hospital, kid." I gripped the thermos with both hands, the heat burning my numb palms. I forced myself to stand up, my knees shaking uncontrollably. I looked out past the dry dock, toward the city skyline of Duluth, glowing against the darkening winter sky. It was almost 4 p.m. "No," I managed to say, my voice raspy and broken. "Not yet. I need to go to my father's maintenance shed first." Elias paused, looking at my soaked clothes and blue lips, but he didn't argue. He understood the kind of rage that keeps a person standing when their body is failing. He had lived with it for 2 years. We drove Elias's battered pickup truck to the active shipyard, bypassing the main offices where Logan's loyalists were probably packing up their desks. We parked behind the old corrugated steel maintenance shed. It was the one place Logan never visited because it smelled of diesel grease and required walking through mud. My hands were still clumsy from the cold, so Elias had to help me pry off the fake electrical panel hidden behind a row of hanging welding masks. Behind it was a reinforced wall safe my father had installed years ago to keep the company's most sensitive physical blueprints safe from water damage. I punched in the combination, my mother's birthday. The heavy door clicked open. Inside lay the true legacy of Vale Marine. I pulled out the original, unstained blueprints of the hull design, bearing the authentic, handwritten safety approvals from the Maritime Administration. Beneath them was a secure USB drive containing the unedited server logs from the week the fake safety reports were generated. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a thick, manila folder of his own. He dropped it onto the workbench beside my blueprints. "I spent 24 months tracking the IP addresses of the terminal that approved the faulty cargo ship designs that ruined my name," Elias said, his voice thick with suppressed anger. "They trace back to a private routing network registered to your brother's shell company. I just never had the access clearance to prove it in court." "You do now?" I whispered, sliding his folder into my waterproof satchel. We left the shipyard and drove straight into the heart of downtown Duluth. Logan had chosen a high-end, glass-walled notary and corporate law office to finalize the sale of the fleet. It was the kind of pristine, sterile environment where deals were done over sparkling water and leather-bound portfolios, far removed from the grease and rust of the ships being sold. When Elias and I walked through the revolving glass doors of the lobby, the receptionist actually stood up in alarm. I looked like I had crawled out of a shipwreck. My boots were soaked and squeaking against the polished marble. My jeans were heavy with freezing lake water. My jacket was smeared with black grease and orange rust from the ballast tank. I left a trail of dirty, freezing water with every step I took. I didn't stop at the front desk. I walked straight toward the grand glass conference room at the end of the hall. Through the transparent walls, I could see Logan. He was wearing a flawless navy suit, smiling his charming, practiced smile, holding an expensive fountain pen over a stack of transfer contracts. 3 executives from the black market shipping firm sat across from him, returning the smile. I placed my freezing, grease-stained hand on the polished chrome handle of the conference room door. It was time to introduce the boardroom to the deep water. I pushed the heavy glass door open. It didn't slam or crash. It just swung wide with a heavy, expensive silence. The sterile scent of artisan coffee and expensive cologne in the boardroom was instantly overwhelmed by the sharp, metallic stench of frozen lake water, diesel fuel, and decaying rust. I stepped onto the plush, cream-colored carpet. Freezing water dripped from the hem of my jacket, leaving dark, muddy stains with every step I took toward the massive mahogany table. Logan's fountain pen froze an inch above the signature line of the transfer contract. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a wax figure. For 3 agonizing seconds, his brain short-circuited, completely unable to process how the sister he had buried inside a freezing steel tomb was standing in a downtown corporate office. The 3 executives from the black market shipping firm stared at me in revulsion and alarm. Logan recovered his mask, though it was slipping badly. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with trembling fingers, and looked at the executives with a practiced, deeply sorrowful expression. "I apologize, gentlemen," Logan said, his voice carrying a desperate, manufactured gentleness. "This is exactly the tragic mental decline I warned you about. My sister is severely exhausted. She has been wandering the shipyard, clearly confused and unwell. I will have security escort her to a hospital immediately, so we can finalize this." 2 years ago, that tone would have made me doubt my own sanity. Today, it sounded like exactly what it was: the pathetic panic of a cornered thief. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked directly to the head of the table, reached into my waterproof satchel, and dropped the heavy, grease-stained stack of original blueprints directly onto the pristine transfer contracts. "I am not exhausted, Logan," I said quietly, the stillness of my voice cutting through the room sharper than shouting ever could. "I am just finished carrying you." I slid the blueprints across the glass. The authentic, handwritten safety seals from the Maritime Administration stared back at the executives. "The structural reports my brother provided you are forged," I told the buyers, looking them dead in the eye. He altered the safety logs to artificially devalue the fleet, bypassing the board's oversight to sell you our ships at a fraction of their worth in exchange for an undisclosed consulting fee routed to his private LLC. Logan slammed his hand on the table. "She is delusional. Do not listen to her. She doesn't know what she's saying." The heavy glass door opened again. Elias Vance stepped into the boardroom, looking like a storm that had finally made landfall. He walked past Logan without even acknowledging his existence and placed his thick manila folder next to my blueprints. "My name is Elias Vance," he said, his gravelly voice commanding absolute attention. "Former Chief Inspector for Vale Marine. That folder contains the IP routing logs proving that Logan Vale operated the terminal that faked the catastrophic hull reports 2 years ago, the same terminal he used yesterday to forge his sister's psychiatric evaluation." The room went completely breathless. The lead executive from the shipping firm looked at the grease-stained blueprints, then at Elias's IP logs, and finally at Logan's pale, sweating face. These men operated in the gray areas of the maritime industry, but they were not stupid. They knew the difference between a distressed asset and a federal crime scene. Without a word, the lead executive stood up, snapped his briefcase shut, and walked out of the room. His associates followed instantly. "Wait, we have a binding agreement!" Logan shouted, his voice cracking, completely losing his corporate polish. He reached for the contracts, but the corporate notary sitting at the end of the table had already pulled her official seal away, her eyes wide with horror as she quickly packed her bag. Then came the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. Elias hadn't just called an ambulance when he cut me out of that tank. He had called the Port Authority Police and a federal maritime fraud investigator. 3 uniformed officers stepped into the boardroom. Logan backed away from the table until his shoulders hit the floor-to-ceiling glass window. The city of Duluth stretched out behind him, but he had nowhere left to run. The charismatic banker who had tried to steal our father's legacy without getting his hands dirty was finally forced to face the mess he had made. As the officer pulled Logan's hands behind his back and the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked into place, he looked at me. There was no apology in his eyes, only a bitter, terrifying disbelief that the quiet sister who had always done the heavy lifting had finally dropped the weight on him. They led him out of the glass room, and for the first time in 5 weeks, I felt warm. The aftermath of that afternoon changed the shipyard forever. Logan's meticulously built house of cards collapsed under the weight of the federal investigation. He was indicted for corporate fraud, forgery, and felony reckless endangerment. The prosecutors didn't need to argue about the business transfer. They simply played the 911 dispatch tapes, showed the angle grinder marks on the ballast tank door, and presented the forged psychiatric records. Logan accepted a plea deal to avoid a longer sentence, but he will not see the outside of a prison for at least 8 years. I took full control of Vale Marine. The first executive decision I made was reinstating Elias Vance with full back pay and a position on the board of directors. We cleaned house. We fired the yes-men Logan had hired, updated our safety protocols, and went back to doing what my father had taught us, building ships that respect the water. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howls off the lake and the metal of the dry docks groans in the cold, I walk down to the edge of the pier. I look at the massive, rusted hulls waiting to be repaired, and I no longer see them as cold, unforgiving traps. I see them as armor. People who betray you rarely do it with a weapon. They do it with a smile, a sympathetic hand on your shoulder, and a whispered assurance that they are only doing what is best for you. They will try to lock you in the dark, hoping the cold and the isolation will make you forget your own strength. But blood does not obligate you to drown quietly to keep someone else's ship afloat. Protecting your legacy is not an act of betrayal, it is an act of survival. If you're currently sitting in the dark, doubting your own memory because someone you love is carefully rewriting the truth to make you look crazy, do not let them take your voice. You are not exhausted. You are not broken. You are just carrying a burden that was never yours to bear. Have you ever had to protect your life, your reputation, or your sanity from someone who claimed they were just trying to help you? Have you ever had to walk into a room and drop the truth on the table? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and remember, sometimes the only way to survive the freezing water is to become harder than the steel that surrounds you. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.